Welcome to Data Center Knowledge Fast Chat, sponsored by Legrand Data Power and Control. I'm Rebecca Harold, CEO of Privacy and Security Brainiac SaaS Services, and also of the Privacy Professor Consultancy. You know, I started my career as a systems engineer at a large corporation. Network applications and data availability was of utmost importance to the business. It still is for all businesses. Ensuring power availability was and is still key to having availability to digital resources. To meet as close to 100% uptime as possible to meet business goals requires securing the power source from multiple threats, and it also supports various compliance requirements. Our guest today is Jason Chantelot, Product Manager at Legrand Data Power and Control Division. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Jason, what are some of the power, security, and access control challenges that data center operators face today?
Man, what a great question, Rebecca. It's such a complex environment for data center operators, and they have the challenge of implementing security controls at every level, whether it's their enterprise data center or an edge site. There's just so many different devices that they have to worry about. If we think about the critical infrastructure today, the power chain, from the very top to the very bottom at the rack level, like some of our products, it's every one of those devices is on the network and collecting data. And so it becomes a risk when we think about security today. Over the last decade or so, we have continued to see an increase in compute at the edge locations. In fact, if I remember back 20 years ago to my time working in a data center, edge really wasn't a term we used back then, but we did have remote sites. I think back to the retail organization that I worked for, and we had a certain amount of devices at those locations. However, what I noticed over a very short period of time, I would say from 2003 to 2008, I noticed that we were increasing the compute level at those remote site locations. So if you think of the different business segments that are out there today, like healthcare, and because of the amount of compute that is required now at these edge locations, they don't all have all those security controls that you might see at the enterprise data center locations. And in some cases, they don't even have a way to necessarily lock down that equipment or that infrastructure at those remote sites or edge locations. It's great. It's an important aspect to improving the availability for users and customers at those edge locations, reducing things like latency. But it also raises a whole set of other security challenges. I think back to some of the conversations that I've had with customers over the years, and what I noticed really from about 2010 on was an increased conversation around physical security at the edge location. And it's amazing, even today in 2023, that I'm still having these conversations with customers today. But you also think back, or I also think about, compliance, even though, we don't necessarily think about that in terms of threats or vulnerabilities. There are increasing requirements around compliance that can put heavier loads on the already, in some cases, burdened security staff or data center operational staff. And so what you see is this, what happens is, because of the reduced staff in a lot of ways, they end up pushing portions of their workloads maybe off to the cloud. And that can raise some other concerns and challenges as well. They may not be responsible for a large portion of the security at the cloud location, of course, but they still have configurations and things like that they're setting, within the applications that are being hosted on the cloud. And so it could be a human error that becomes a big challenge or opens up a giant risk within an application. And so I think, a big part of it is understanding how the data center has transitioned over the years. I always used to tell the story of what it took for me to actually get into the data center and stand in front of the rack where I needed to do some work. Those security controls have been a well documented layer approach for many, many, many years. But as we transitioned to edge locations and as we transitioned to Internet of Things, everything is connected. I think my toaster upstairs is connected, Rebecca,
Yes.
nowadays, right? These become risks. This is an opportunity for threat actors to get a hold of that device and perform some malicious action.
That's so true. I mean, and when you were talking about all those different endpoints, all those different types of devices, it reminded me of the firmware that is so different throughout all of those devices, and how those need to be addressed as well. So when you're thinking about firmware, can you explain some of the firmware advances in rack PDU technology that can address these wide ranges of security and access control challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I just think back through my career, just watching the transition of what capabilities existed with PDU firmware. Gosh, as far back as I would say 2009 for myself anyway, where it was a very simplistic authentication system where you could get in and then see the important data that's being collected by that system. And now, when I think about what we have developed here at Legrand with our Rack PDU business, it is like an enterprise software solution when it comes to the firmware, specifically around the security controls that we implement. The best way that I like to describe some of these controls is through a well-known framework. If we think about things like it's called AAA, or authentication, authorization, and accounting, these are important aspects or can help us sum up what is required for these security controls nowadays with all the threats that we have in front of us. So if I look at those, right, I think about authentication. This is what is our identity through a set of credentials, right? The username and passwords. And I was just reading one of the latest data breach reports, and credentials are still at the top of the list as a way that a lot of our bad actors can get into a lot of these systems. So it's important to think about authentication and authorization together, because once we have that username and password, and in some cases we've got technologies like multi-factor authentication, which is saying, hey, there's something that I have, and then that there's something that I know, which is a really important aspect to think about in what we implement in our systems as well. But authorization is the resources that our credentials give us access to through that system. And then with accounting, that last aspect, this is just the record of my actions during the time that I was logged into that system. And so if I think about the Xeris firmware that we currently run across our Rack PDU, as we call it, our common platform, both for example, the PX4 and the Pro 4X models, now that Raritan and Server Technologies are under one umbrella with Legrand, that common platform provides those very capabilities through that single firmware system. So it's a very important aspect, to, at least at the start of authenticating to that system in order to get the data that you need that the Rack PDU is using. But also, it also goes to some of our accessory products as well. I think about our smart lock solution, which plays into security extremely well at a physical level. As I mentioned previously, we talked about those edge locations and the challenges that we have physically securing those racks. We have a solution here at Legrand called Smart Lock that allows us to basically install an RFID card reader with the swing handle at the front of the rack to provide a set of authentication protocols in order for that user to get into the rack. And so if we think about it that way, you can control those functions directly from the Xeris firmware as well. And with multi-factor, again, it's something that I have, a card, an ID card that is RFID. And then there's something that I know. Maybe it's a 4-digit code, so that those two aspects just give me that one extra step. And when I think about security, I think about defense in depth, and that's a good example of that. We need to have multiple levels or levels of redundancy in place nowadays in order to continue to make sure that we are not at risk as much with those systems.
I love hearing all of that. I'm definitely a fan of multiple layers of security, that's for sure. And all of the technology you described sounds very helpful for hardening the security within an enterprise. But you know, a lot of data centers aren't that new, or there's a lot of data centers that are struggling and trying to figure out, you know, how to become more secure. So how does the technology that you just described fit and work within an existing data center infrastructure?
Yeah, great question. I think of a few different aspects to this. One, with our Xeris firmware, we have an amazing set of integration tools. We have an entire software development kit that really allows for easy automation. It allows for seamless data transfer for our customers. Maybe they want to take some of the important data that we're collecting, say on the rack PDU side, and they want to integrate that into aspects of their building management system or their building automation system. Or also maybe they want to integrate some of those capabilities or those metrics directly into their DSIM solution that they may be running on site. We provide that complete SDK to give our customers the ability to see or use that interoperability, which is so important, to allow them to work smarter, right? More efficiently. They can go to that one DSIM system, and not only can they see that critical data that we're capturing from a rack PDU perspective, but they can also launch, maybe a session directly to the firmware from that other system, whether it be DSIM or whether it be a building management system. The SDK becomes an important aspect to making sure that we have that ability for customers to take that data we're collecting and use it how they see fit across their environment to allow them to work a little smarter. I also think back to authentication that we were just talking about. One of the things that we do to help organizations, with having Xeris firmware fit into their existing environments are remote authentication protocol capabilities. So we have the ability within the Xeris firmware, for example, to integrate their Active Directory environment for access to the rack PDU data. So that's really important because from the Active Directory perspective, that database controls, or is an important aspect of those security controls for authentication and authorization. And so they can essentially use that same system, that same common system, and provide access to the Xeris firmware from that database. So that becomes an important component to that. And we provide access not just through Active Directory, but also through multiple other protocols like Radius and TechX Plus, for example. And then I also think back to the Smart Lock solution. If I think about the physical security requirements that are out there today, our Smart Lock solution, through, again, that common firmware, right, that we've been talking about, the Xeris firmware, it allows our customers to still continue to use those same ID cards, those same proximity cards that they're using at various access points through their building. We can then implement those same capabilities at the rack level through our Xeris firmware and the Smart Lock solution that we offer.
That's a a very important point and very valuable, I know, to many organizations. Thank you, Jason, for this great information. You've provided some really excellent and actionable advice that I know our listeners can start putting to use right away. Thank you, audience, for joining us today on Fast Chat. I'm Rebecca Harold from Privacy and Security Brainiac SaaS Services and also the Privacy Professor Consultancy. Please join us for our next episode of Fast Chats.